Police Minister Bheki Cele recently revealing in Parliament that there is a dire shortage of detectives across nearly all 9 provinces, and the numbers are staggering. The worst affected province is the Northwest, with a 32% shortage of detectives. So we're asking this morning, what impact does this have on crime prevention? How critical is the role of a detective in combating crime, and what is being done to address these various issues? To help us tackle these questions, let's welcome Dr. Ivor Chipkin, who is with the New South Institute. Ivor, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. And I like the research pack that you've done and what we've used to prepare for our interview, because you start off by asking a very, very basic question, and that is, what is the function of police? And one might think that is an obvious question, but perhaps the answer has got sort of muddled over the past 30 years or so.
Good morning, Michelle. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. And yes, thank you for starting there. I think it's such an obvious thing to engage, and yet we don't ask that question. What are police supposed to do? And what's been incredible in the work that we've been doing is to see how that question, the answer to that question, has changed in fundamental and rather surprising ways. So if you take the apartheid period, where the function of the police largely was to protect and sustain and maintain the system of white domination, we go through a period in the late 1990s where the purpose of the police changes, for the good obviously, to make South Africa a safer place for ordinary South Africans. And what we see in the late 1990s, for the first time in South African history, it should be added, black working class families or black families are able to call on the police for the first time ever when they're faced with an emergency, break-in, insalubrious conditions, a threat, or some kind of worry, a threat. They call on the police, and the police are largely in that period they're responding to those situations. It's quite astonishing. The police never historically responded to situations of danger or alarm in black areas. So something fundamental shifted in the 1990s. But then in the 2000s we see another shift. That the police start reverting back to an old pattern, not of protecting whites, but of protecting political elites. And instead what we see is the police start becoming embroiled or caught up in the internal contestation and fighting within the ruling party itself. And what we start finding is that the police are no longer serving a general public. If you phone a police station today, they might not answer, or very seldom do they answer. Because what's happening essentially is the police is becoming a force that is caught up in the internal contestation within the ANC and is serving various elements or factions or networks within the ANC itself. And what we've argued essentially is that the police as a service lose its focus on ordinary South Africans and protecting ordinary South Africans, making neighborhoods safe, making streets safe, responding to our calls, etc., but rather responding to the internal contestation within the African National Congress. And you see that through the fundamental changes in spending patterns within the ANC, with cutting back of budgets, but also just lack of investment in ordinary policing. The number of ordinary policemen declines dramatically. The number of money being spent on the maintenance of police stations declines dramatically. So if we go to our police stations today, they often don't look great. They're not maintaining them properly, and often that's just a lack of money. They're not investing in those issues. A lack of equipment, vehicles. How often have you heard in response to a situation that the police don't have vehicles to come out? They're not spending vehicles. They're not spending on radio systems, on fingerprint kits. So all the basics of policing, what we've seen over the last 20 years, is a decline in investment in all those sorts of areas. Detective services is a key area. Crime intelligence, the politicization of all these functions, and related to that, the lack of spending in all those areas. So what we've seen over the last 20 years is a dramatic decline in the ability of the police to combat crime.
You talk about the changes that happened in police from the 90s into the 2000s, and obviously that coincided with Bheki Cele, who was police commissioner from 2000 and something. I can't remember the exact dates now. And I wonder, Ivor, how much of a role the people at the top of the SAPS, commissioners, ministers, how much of a role their leadership style also has to play in the function of the police. and Bheki Cele and his repeated utterances of shoot to kill over the years as Commissioner and now as Minister as well come to mind?
So we think this is one of the decisive factors, and I think we don't look at it enough. It's the kind of leadership which in the police, and what we've been arguing is that the police essentially has been deprofessionalization of the leadership of the police. Instead of having career policemen coming up into key positions, we're often having people that have political credibility rather than professional credibility coming into senior service. And you've seen this in the tremendous instability within the police leadership over the last 20 years. Commissioners coming and going based on internal disputes and conflicts within the ANC, and we think that reflects the tremendous political turbulence within the senior leadership of the police. So we've argued, I think, which positions our report slightly differently to some of the other work that's been done. It's not so much ordinary policing. It's not so much ordinary police personnel. Yes, they could probably be better skilled and better trained, but the signal's really coming from the top as to what the direction is and what police should be focusing on. There's so much sort of anthropological work done on policing, which just demonstrates that police, in many cases, in policing quite difficult neighborhoods, often don't have the resources, they don't have the backup, and as a result, they're often afraid to go into difficult areas. I mean, that is just a situation which is unsustainable, and we're seeing it now with this extraordinary rise in the crime rates, and especially the murder rates. I think the latest figures are the highest in 20 years. I mean, it's just unsustainable. We're living in a country where it's just fundamentally, on a day-to-day basis, it's dangerous for you and I, and that is a function of the decline in the ability of the police.
Yeah, and yet every quarter we have the release of the crime statistics, and there is a real effort to paint a picture to say that things are improving, and yet the numbers don't bear that out, right? The rising levels of all kinds of violent crime and the declining numbers insofar as officers and boots on the ground is concerned. I'm seeing, according to reports this morning, that there's a 90% drop, for example, in police reservists, and that's coupled with that 8,000 drop in detectives on the force. How do we even begin to address this?
So if our analysis is correct, that a lot of this is coming from instability, deprofessionalization of the police leadership, I think our start comes there. And this is where, strangely enough, the politicians, and the president in particular, has a high degree of authority and discretion in this matter. That we need to start rethinking about how we appoint a senior leadership in the police. Who becomes a police general? Who becomes the police commissioner? Who becomes heads of police stations, for example? How we think about recruitment in these areas. And I think we could start quite quickly in this regard by allowing a process whereby the police allow their own skilled and professionals to rise up into the organization and into leadership positions. I mean, some of the turmoil, some of the turnover that you're talking about, the declines in detectives, etc. These are incredibly frustrating jobs, especially if you are ambitious, especially if you are talented, especially if you're successful, because essentially what's happening is you're hitting a glass ceiling. You can't get into certain positions, no matter how well you perform in your role, because essentially the criteria being used to select people into those key senior positions are not the basis of your police record as a professional. There are other considerations, there are political considerations, and as a result, for many police staff trying to do their job well, the police is an incredibly dysfunctional working environment, and I think this is why we're seeing so many police detectives leaving the organization. Why so many people are not wanting to go into the police, because these are very, very difficult places to work in, especially if you want to do your job well.
Yeah. Not overstating the importance of police in a country like ours. Not least because of the fact that corruption is so rife, right? What you've just described goes a long way to explaining just the morale of officers on the ground as well. The fact that your record doesn't dictate how your career is going to unfold. I've lost my train of thought for just a moment there, Ivor, but I wonder, if we look back at gangsterism, for example, in the Western Cape, I'm bringing that up as an example, but of course it exists in many other parts of the country as well. There's a lot of suspicion when it comes to the effectiveness of police, their willingness to help. Can I trust a police officer pulling me over on the side of the road, for example? And then on the other hand, there's also this real perception that the only way things like certain crimes, including gangsterism and drugs, can flourish, guns that are rife, that we know have been stolen from police stores, the only way those things can flourish is indeed with the involvement of police. You know, these two things, the morale of officers who, many of them are trying to do their best, putting their lives on the line every day, and those on the other side of it who are now part and parcel of the problem.
Yeah, I think you put your finger something on profound, and I mean, others have written and spoken much more about this and in a much better position than I am. I mean, look at if you read the biography of Very, sort of a senior policeman from the Western Cape, he makes that point exactly. The police were making, in the police teams that he was involved in, they were making important gains against gangsterism in the Western Cape. And yet the unit, as it was becoming successful, started attracting political attention, and eventually the unit is dissolved. And this is what we've seen. So many setbacks, so advances in the policing by talented professional policemen running up against a political environment where suddenly that becomes awkward for political leadership, and those units getting closed down. So that's one of the situations. So it's not as if our policing situation is hopeless. There are thousands, tens of thousands of talented policemen in the service. Yep. This is what's so frustrating about it. We tie their hands behind the back. And in that context, you talked about gangsterism. I mean, this is the work the Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime has been making the point that in this environment of a highly politicized police service, where people are being recruited not necessarily on the basis that they're professional policemen, but on the basis of their political links, you're seeing organized crime infiltrate many institutions, including the police. So that's particularly the case in the Western Cape, but I think elsewhere in the world, in KZN with these various mafias active. I think you're starting to see the penetration of organized crime into policing itself, and that of course is a very dire situation, and it's translating of course into these quite shocking crime statistics for people for you and I, where our lives are literally in danger in many cases. Yeah,
and like you say, the murder rate, the highest we've seen in at least 2 decades. Dr. Ivor Chipkin, great pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much for coming on to the program. And yeah, it's important that we do pay tribute to those men and women in blue, tens of thousands of them, who every day are putting their lives on the line and swimming upstream. Ivor, thanks very much indeed for joining us.